hot off the press, and I mean hot off the press this morning, we have this from Humankind, the brand new What's Next roadmap. And as you can see, it's stretching through from right now through until around the end of March 2023. And inside of it, they've revealed not only some improvements to existing gameplay features, but also on the right-hand side of the screen here, you can see new content as well. So we have existing features being reformed and then new content being added over the course of the next few months as we move through, round out the rest of 2022, see you later, and move into 2023. Now, this isn't the first time that Humankind, the team at Amplitude, have produced a roadmap like this. And alongside of it, of course, they've been thinking and responding to community feedback just like they always do. And a lot of the things that are on this list do draw heavily from some of the common criticisms that I've seen, that I've heard, and that I've dealt through what is now many hundreds of hours in Humankind. So without any further ado, I've chucked the improvements for starters over on the left-hand side of the screen. I'll leave them there over my ugly mug while I deal with Huck. By the way, the footage in this video is highlights from the most recent community multiplayer session, or at least sort of a supercut version of a portion of that game. So I hope you enjoy that. In the background, let's discuss improvements. These all look very exciting to me. Of course, we don't have all of the detail yet, right? These are, to a certain extent, still high-level ideas. However, we can draw on them fairly easily, I think, particularly if you're someone like me who's, perhaps spends a lot of time talking about Humankind or thinking about it or reading about it on the forums, whatever it may be. I think that we'll just start from the top and run through. Stealth overhaul. If you don't know, stealth is a mechanic where units can hide in plain sight, but not in plain sight because they can't be seen, of course. In Humankind, the stealth mechanic itself is actually very good. I've used it a little bit, but really I didn't quite understand it until I started playing some modded games, in particular with the Cultures of Nintendo mod pack, where I started to realize, wow, stealth is powerful not just on the map, but also within battles as well. Individual units can be stealthed when you zoom in to that, sort of battlefield in the trenches, manual battle control scenario, map, whatever you want to call it. And so I think that overhauling that system to make it more transparent and easier to understand is probably perhaps one of the biggest steps that could be taken here. It's a brilliant system. I just don't really fully understand it. And I also feel like maybe it's not particularly accessible, like it's not particularly obvious or particularly upfront. So maybe we see some improvements in that respect. Otherwise, I'm not sure. Maybe it gets buffed or nerfed, right? As with all of these things, we could see them buff or nerf, lift things up or push things down. They've tried both and, in my opinion, generally done a pretty good job at handling it. But again, this is just the opinion of but one moron on the internet. Let's move along. Secondly, third-party reinforcements. This is referring to one of the most common gripes in Humankind, where you have more than two parties engaging in conflict, war probably, but it could even just be a skirmish in neutral territory or something like that. Very difficult to reinforce. In fact, it's basically impossible. You kind of just have to fight 1v1 and then, wait for your mate to finish and then you go in and give them a go, sort of thing. It's a little messy, it's difficult, and it doesn't really work particularly well. So hopefully what this is referring is essentially a fix for that. Allowing us to reinforce, maybe it's just with our allies, maybe it's with neutral parties as well. Again, who's to say? That detail is still likely being ironed out, to be fair, given how far away some of these could be. Either way, that will be a very good improvement to kind of polish off a lot of the improvements that they made in the previous Humankind What's Next roadmap, which were largely focused around, if you think about the changes that have been made over the last few months, actually over the last year, really, it's been improvements to war score, to war support, to pillaging, to all of these things that go around the war system. Now, if we can bring in additional parties, bring in those sort of more diplomatic controls for dealing with complex battles, complex wars, that would be great to see. This one here interests me a lot. Maritime gameplay is up third. I really do quite like the way that Humankind handles the sea. I think there's a lot of interesting things, Lighthouse of Alexandria, or you take a militarist build with militarist naval cultures. Maybe you go for more of the sort of seafaring trader route. There's loads of different combos you can do, and it does a really great job at it. However, if I were to highlight some flaws, I could say, well, the ocean tiles aren't particularly varied. Navigable rivers is still something that I've been crying out for in every single Civilization 7 wishlist video I've ever made, and I will continue to hope that one day we'll see some really good versions of that. But I think maybe at a more simple level, this could be looking potentially at the different types of units available in the game. How strong are they? Are they useful in engaging with cities? Is the balance quite right? I.e., can they sort of travel fast enough to be useful enough to be unlocked early enough? Who knows? The world is really their oyster. But like I was sort of trying to allude to at the start of this point, I think that they're at least beginning with a reasonably robust base in that naval gameplay in Humankind works well. And they've had to iron out a few issues, certainly with things like naval sieges in particular. So there's maybe more work like that to be done as well. We'll have to wait and see. But I'm particularly excited for that because I'm a big fan of a harbor run. And anybody who's tuned into one of my many Humankind gameplay live streams may very well know that. Fourth up, we have independent peoples. This is, of course, how Humankind refers to barbarians, those neutral tribes that sort of pop up and disappear. You can trade with them a little bit. You can buy their resources off them. You can befriend them. You can assimilate them. And, of course, you can fight them and earn military stars off of them. You can do a few other interactions with them at the moment in the game, rent their armies, that kind of thing. But by and large, they're a fairly, I think, good part of the game, like quite well designed, but perhaps not the most interesting or varied. They are all very much sort of one and the same. And while the relationships are good and they work well, I don't often find I'm reaching out to go and find them. Perhaps there's sort of something a little bit missing that personally I think Civilization does really well, in that each city-state has its own identity, its own missions, its own rewards, its own flavor. Essentially, it has its own cultural affinity, right? It would be really fascinating to see that be brought through, or to see a whole load of other ways that you could borrow ideas around how to make those essentially neutral NPC factions that don't really do much and should never obviously outweigh the actual opponents. Otherwise, you're just having more actual opponents. But how they sort of bring that forward, I think will be very interesting to see. I'm looking forward to that as well. Fifth, we have user interface. And potentially this has some overlap, not completely, but some overlap with then accessibility. And then finally, quality of life improvements. Accessibility and user interface improvements are almost always, it seems to be, to me anyway, needed in almost every game. It's something that I think is, for various complicated reasons, quite difficult to get right. Or at least that's how it appears to me from largely from the outside. I've received some really good detailed feedback around accessibility and user interface experiences. Everything from menus to color schemes to how easy it is to actually read or understand the information that Humankind is displaying. And I think whether you have accessibility difficulties or not, wherever you consider yourself on that spectrum perhaps, regardless, it's always nice to have a more accessible user interface. A user interface that's easier to use, easier to learn, easier to navigate. That just, in my opinion, will always make for a better player experience. So to sort of constantly seek feedback and improve on those things, I think is really important, not just to ensure that everybody can play Humankind just like I can, but also to make sure that our overall quality of life is good and that the game is actually enjoyable in of itself. Moving along, you may notice over on the left-hand side, I've changed it now from improvements to new content. So what we've just discussed, that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 overall sort of overarching themes for improvements are ways that the team have signaled that they're going to change existing features within the game. We're looking at stealth, third-party reinforcements, maritime gameplay, independent peoples, user interface and accessibility. So broadly speaking, it's things to do with conflict, and it's things to do with relationships, basically. Third-party reinforcements, independent peoples, that kind of thing. New content, though, can stretch a little further than that. Some of these won't come as any surprise, but I think there are some interesting theories to unpack. There are certainly often a lot of rumors circulating online, and I'm sure that you'll be able to dig some various ones out for the kinds of things that might be coming to Humankind. But for now, let's stick to the facts and what we actually have available. First up, cultures, new content. This really shouldn't surprise anybody. If we reflect on the year that's already been, we have, of course, 2 new culture packs, right? Each one introducing at least one new culture to each era. The Mississippians were a free new culture more recently, that kind of with the Latin America pack that sort of added 2 in one era. But essentially, we're getting an extra culture in each era, a few natural wonders, just kind of sprinkling a nice little bit of extra goodness over top of each existing element within the game. And alongside that, of course, there have been various patch updates that have kind of reformed those systems as well. If we think about how the religious tenets have been changed, perhaps, things like that. I would expect us to see exactly the same kind of culture packs, or perhaps a civilization style game expansion plus culture pack, right? A really popular strategy for 4X historical strategy games to follow, right? And I would expect that to be the case. I also think that if we look back through Amplitude's history, we'll see, again, that fairly familiar routine to DLC. And as I've argued many times on stream, often with a 4X game like this, or like Civilization 6, is one that I'll draw on a lot. Different studio, but obviously very similar genre. Year 2 is often a big year in terms of content. Year 1 is reforming, it's balancing, it's fixing bugs, it's ensuring that the user experience is stable. And then year 2, we start to see more significant developments. With Civilization 6, it was the release of its first main DLC pack, right? The big, meaty kind of rise and fall, then gathering storm, right? Those sort of once every 1, maybe every 2 years, if we're unlucky, kind of packs. And hopefully we'll see that with Humankind. You can see again, the rest of this list fits that same descriptor. Not just cultures, but wonders. Interestingly, game systems next, but also some of that higher level stuff like narrative events. And then lastly, they go on to mention challenges and more. I'll leave the and more for you to try and unpack. The challenges are likely to mirror the things that we've already seen. That summer heat scenario, now moving through to the 100 Years War scenario, which now is actually sort of built into the game within the play menu. It has its own historically accurate map of England and France from the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages during the 100 Years War. I had a great time playing it on stream today, and I would hope that the Humankind team, where they mentioned challenges here with this new content, that they'll continue to at least hold them to that standard. If not, of course, ideally, would always love to see them get better and better and better. But at least holding them to that standard, I think they've found a really good place for the current challenge. Backtracking slightly to narrative events, great. Always love to see those expanded. Don't forget, Humankind has a somewhat nuanced narrative event system in that your decisions that you make, i.e. how you respond to the people protesting, or whether we should let them paint, or whatever it may be, does impact the civics or the sort of societal axes of your culture. So if you choose to take a more conservative traditional decision, you will move towards tradition and away from progressive politics, or whatever the alternative is on the axis in Humankind. And I think that maybe there's something to play with there to elaborate on. But at the very least, just having more narrative events, making them fresh and fun and exciting, is always a good thing. Perhaps the most interesting thing here of all is that third point, though, isn't it? Game systems. And this kind of relates back to what I was talking about earlier. where we have Humankind now moving into its second year, right? Let's not forget, it's just finished, actually, celebrating its birthday as of today. Humankind had a 5-day birthday party where cities were turned into cakes. It was absolutely fantastic. Easily best update of the year. Oh, wow, that's probably not true. The IBN Batuta update was a dang good update. In fact, they all have been, to be fair. But anyway, enough fanboying. Let's get back to the facts. That point there around game systems is the most interesting. There are many areas of Humankind that are somewhat not underdeveloped is actually the wrong word. It's not that they're underdeveloped. It's just that there is more that could be added. And that might sound like, oh, that's a bit of a cop-out, the same thing. But they're not the same thing, actually, because if something is underdeveloped to me, then it's not functioning. There are a few areas in Humankind where you could argue that that could be the case. Maybe you've had difficulty in multiplayer or whatever it may be for you. However, by and large, that isn't true. It's just there are places where more can be added. We can see that with their improvements, stealth, third-party reinforcements, independent peoples, maritime gameplay, right? These are all acknowledgements of things that where more can be added. And then if we think, okay, so that's what's being added to existing systems. What systems are missing overall in Humankind? What kind of game systems would we even want? And actually, this would be a great point for me, not just to pump the YouTube algorithm, although if you haven't liked the video and you've made it this far, you're probably a great candidate to like the video, so I will begrudgingly ask you. But actually, I was going to say you should leave your feedback, because these kind of videos often get a little bit of coverage and airtime, and sometimes the right people could see them. So, speak your mind kindly, and let's have a chat. But either way, I think that those game systems, and if we think about which ones are missing, could be the most exciting thing of all. Again, it's easy, I think, to draw conclusions or connections to a game like Civilization 6, right? Think about what Civ 6 does, and in particular, what Civ 6 added. I think about things like natural disasters and natural events. They add a level of entropy and randomness that is fun in the early game, changes the map, makes it more fertile, potentially, but it's also dynamic in the late game. It helps to add a challenge to a period of the game where it can often either feel like you've already lost or already won. You're moving through the motions, just kind of trying to get to the end. And sometimes those random events, as frustrating as they can be at times, can help to keep that, I think, kind of alive, a little bit spicy, Great people, potentially another way to do that. Heroes, another way to do that. I've always harped on about the World Congress. I think that a good end game, late game diplomacy system is so important to keeping a late game fresh, just like those other things that I mentioned. And it's not just that Humankind in particular suffers from a late game sort of issue here as well, I should note. It's just more broadly a comment that is generally made about 4X historical strategy games. Like I mentioned before, you can kind of get a bit sort of, is it done yet, almost? In my opinion, Humankind is slightly better than most, but not perfect in that regard. There are probably a few other systems as well that we could think about how Humankind could build on itself. The trains and the airplanes are great, but perhaps like stealth, maybe a little bit lost or misunderstood. And as we often discuss on live streams, a new game, I don't know if it's quite a game system, but something I've always been quite interested in is how the later game could be expanded on a bit. Perhaps an additional era at the end, or some sort of fracturing, a post-information age, or I don't know, whatever you want, post-information. I mean, like information technology, not fake news. But you know what? If it fits, that's fine. Either way, I think that there is certainly a lot that we could unpack and a lot that we could theory craft in the game systems, but I might leave it there and round off that new content section. So then let's reflect on what we've heard, what we've seen, and what is next for Humankind. We know that Humankind is going to feature a series of improvements for the remainder of 2022, and after we've got through the Christmas break or the holiday period, likely through into Q1 of 2023 as well. That's the end of March, don't forget, is when Q1 will end. We know that they're focusing on largely systems of combat, of relationship building or diplomacy, and of user interface and quality of life experience. Stealth, third-party reinforcements, independent peoples, then bleeding through into maritime gameplay and the overall user interface and accessibility. We also know that they've signaled that over the next 8 months, we'll be receiving all of the following: new cultures, new wonders, new game systems, and that new really must be stressed, new narrative events, new challenges, and more. And while I can't really unpack the and more anymore right now, I think overall this paints a fairly exciting picture for the future of humankind. Again, as I said at the start of the video, this is not the first time we've seen a what's next like this. In fact, this is the second roadmap. And like the first one, they've signaled that this one will be based on continuous community feedback monitoring, end quote. And content is, of course, subject to change. However, if I think back to the previous one, and I'm happy to make a video discussing that if there's an appetite for it, but when I think back to that one, I think actually they really did manage to tick basically all of the boxes. A few of them were changed slightly based on community feedback and constant monitoring. But from, more recent things like empire name changes back to changes to war support to the overall culture rebalancing that made aesthete cultures fun for the first time in what felt like, well, never. And really a whole load of other ones as well. It really helped to level the playing field. And it seems to me, with a relatively stable, relatively well-performing playfield, at least, of course, I'm speaking to my experience on PC and Steam, your experience on some other minor platforms will probably differ. I am aware that there are improvements to be made there as well. So it's not, of course, a perfect picture. But I do think that this Humankind What's Next improvements and new content roadmap is certainly something to be excited for. And I'm looking forward to covering all of the patches and updates and everything to do with Humankind as we move through. Thank you very much for joining me today. And I really do hope to see you next time. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.